I have two members of the panel present here, and then one will join us virtually. Allow me to introduce the ones who are here, and then I'll introduce the one who's joining us virtually. Dudley Ochiel is our first panelist, and many of you would be familiar with his work. He has more than 10 years experience in litigation, legal research, and appellate advocacy. He is a partner at Bond Advocates LLP and a board member at Kenya Law, which you know is a state corporation which facilitates public access to legal information. He considers his role to be advancing the rule of law, promoting transparency and accountability, and strengthening the legal profession in Kenya. He is also a senior litigation and research counsel at Katiba Institute, an institute that works to promote the implementation and protection of the Constitution. At Katiba, he leads and supports strategic litigation and research on various issues of governance, digital rights, and climate justice, and he has been involved in several landmark cases before the Supreme Court and other courts. He received the Law Society of Kenya's Public Interest Litigation Jurist of the Year Award in 2018, and he's very passionate about using the law as a tool for social change and defending rights and freedoms of people in Kenya. Dudley, may I kindly ask that you take your seat at the podium? Thank you. Our second panelist who will be joining us virtually is Evans Ogada. Evans Ogada is a lawyer who has specialized in constitutional and administrative law litigation. He has handled numerous cases in those areas, and that includes representing the Law Society of Kenya in a petition concerning appointment of judges and 2 petitions on arbitrary arrests. He is a member of the Law Society of Kenya's Public Interest Committee and a member of the Nairobi Branch Constitution and Judicial Review Bar Bench Committee. He has also worked at Katiba Institute, and he teaches public law at the University of Nairobi School of Law. He is also a regular on civil society panels on the rule of law and international criminal law. Mr. Ogada is also an associate editor with the Platform for Law, Justice and Society, a leading social legal publication in Kenya. Mr. Ogada will be joining us virtually, and he'll make his presentation after Dudley. The third person on the panel today is someone who's familiar to us, the Vice Chair of ICJ Kenya, Mr. Chris Gitari. Mr. Chris Gitari is a Senior Transitional Justice Advisor for the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission for the Agreement on the Resolution of the Conflict in the Republic of South Sudan. He's a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators Kenya, a past country director for the International Center for Transitional Justice, a past program manager for Human Rights Protection Program. He's an advocate of the High Court, and he has an LLM from the Fletcher School in Tufts University, an LLB from the University of Nairobi, and a postgraduate in international mediation from Queen Mary University. Mr. Chris Gitari, the floor is also yours. Please take your seat at the podium. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are continuing a conversation on judicial accountability and independence from what our chief guest has said. And I will just give context and then invite our panelists to give us their expert views on the same. And I'll start with what was said by Professor Nwabweze in 1973 in his book, Constitutionalism in Emergent States, where he argued that not even the sternest critics of the doctrine of separation of powers can deny its necessity as regards the judicial functions. He's writing here about judicial independence. And he says, for the rule of law as an element of constitutionality depends more upon how and by what procedure it is interpreted and enforced. The limitations which the law imposes upon the executive and legislative action cannot have much meaning or efficacy unless there is a separate procedure comprising a separate agency and personnel for an authoritative interpretation and enforcement of them. The necessity for a procedure to interpret the law with finality is underlined by the fact that both the executive and the legislature have to interpret the law in the course of carrying out their primary functions. We know that there are Bangalore principles on judicial conduct which have been adopted, as well as the 1985 basic principles on the independence of the judiciary. But the judicial independence is only one side of the coin. The Chief Justices of the SADC region in a 2005 statement have said that insisting on judicial independence does not mean that judicial officers are not accountable for the way they discharge their duties. Trials and other court proceedings are held in open court to the public, including the media, for them to have access. And we must also have reasons being given by the decisions of the courts in their matters. So that means that accountability requires that decisions are reasoned to the public so that we know why judicial officers reach the conclusions they reach, but that also judicial officers perform their duties in accordance with the highest ethical requirements of their office. Our former Chief Justice Evans Gisheru, in a 2007 paper, says, accountability is the other side of the coin of independence of the judiciary. The only question that arises is as to who is to be accountable, it is to be accountable to, and the method or the mechanism of accountability. So this morning we will have reflections from Dudley first. He will give us a civil society perspective on judicial independence and accountability. Then we will hear from Evans Ogada, who will give us a litigator's perspective. And then we will hear from Chris Gitari, who will give us his thoughts around what role do institutions play in ensuring judicial independence and accountability. So for a few minutes, let's hear from Dudley Ochiel. What are his perspectives on the two concepts?
Controlling the court from beyond. The court would be responsive to maybe the executive or to parliament, to whoever has the powers over the judiciary. So you cannot begin to speak about accountability unless you give the judiciary independence. I think that the Kenyan judiciary has sufficient independence, and we can now begin to call it to account. We can ask why. We've given you the resources that you need, financial independence. We've given you the institutional independence. The JSC operates its own calendar. When SRC tried to limit the sittings of JSC, that was fought back, and JSC can sit as many times as it wants. And so we can now begin to ask the judiciary, the Kenyan judiciary, why. We can ask it, why is it that Chapter 6 is dead? Despite all these cases that have been filed to try and enforce Chapter 6, why has the Kenyan judiciary killed Chapter 6? I mean, all these confusing decisions on educational requirements. At one point, it's necessary to have a degree to vie. In another court case, it's not necessary to have it. At one point, it's the IEBC which should, clear candidates and investigate them. At another point, the IEBC has no power to enforce the Electoral Code of Conduct. The why in accountability just ask, why has the judiciary made this decision? And it goes back to Article 10 of our Constitution, which has this culture of justification, where every public functionary must justify their decision and justify it based on the rule of law, on the law. You must point to some rule, some principle as legitimating your key issues around judicial accountability. We feel that we've given the Kenyan judiciary sufficient powers. When the president tries to control or fails to appoint, you see Katiba stepping in. And so for us, what we want to see the judiciary using this power in acceptable ways, in ways that are responsible. This year, we've had two cases that sounded a little bit off for us, and where we think that the judiciary was not being accountable. The Law Society of Kenya tried to take a case to the Supreme Court concerning mass surveillance. The Law Society of Kenya was not a party in the lower cases, but there can be reasons for that. Someone could die, or they could be threatened, as has happened in 2017. Lucianna, I think you know this case, the Japheth Morocco case, where the witnesses were threatened and abandoned the case, and it fell upon a voter to take that case up and to appeal it. The Court of Appeal allowed that because the law in Kenya is that an aggrieved non-party, especially in public law cases, can appeal. So when the Law Society of Kenya took up an appeal on mass surveillance, that was a public law issue. So two things happened. One, the case was dismissed, the Supreme Court saying that, taking us back to Wangari Maathai, that only a person personally aggrieved can appeal a matter. And then it also slapped the Law Society of Kenya with costs. That costs order has the effect of telling people don't try to bring matters before the court. It has a bad effect. And coming from the Supreme Court of Kenya, it sets precedent for the other court, the lower courts. It gives a bad example. It teaches bad manners to the lower courts to try and, stop public interest litigation through cost order. So in those two cases, the issue of Chapter 6, the issue of trying to discourage litigation by using negative cost order against the LSK. Now, if the LSK can be banged with a cost order, negative cost order, who are you at ICJ? Who are you at Katiba Institute? Who are you at these other smaller bodies? So I think maybe that's my input for now. I would wait for another opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dudley. Dudley is raising fundamental questions about, I like the way he's referred to it, judicial dictatorship. Are we living under a culture of judicial dictatorship? You can't speak back to the Supreme Court when they issue a decree, and we know under the Constitution we are bound by the decisions that come from the Supreme Court. And I don't know whether, Evans, if you can hear us, you have similar views to what Dudley has given us. We'd like to hear your perspective as a practitioner before we open up to the plenary. So if you can hear us, the floor is yours.
Good morning.
Good morning. We can hear you. Go right ahead, sir.
Living to the spirit and the letter of the Constitution 2010. From a practitioner's perspective, we certainly could do better. The Constitution as a body of fundamental principles, according to which activities of state ought to be conducted, decrees at Article 171 that judicial accountability ought to happen through the platform of the Judicial Service Commission. Well, from the practitioner's perspective, we have had our concerns with the Judicial Service Commission. The latest of those concerns was a letter penned by the president of the Law Society of Kenya, where he complained about the treatment meted out to advocates by members of the commission, advocates in Eldoret and in Mombasa. The JSC, from a practitioner's perspective, has been operating in a rather opaque manner. Nobody knows what really happens at the JSC in terms of disciplinary, in terms of holding judicial officers to account. The JSC operates like a secretive organization. We get very little information in terms of what's happening down there. Now, what needs to be remembered is that accountability is coterminous with responsibility. Judicial independence is granted, yes, but accountability, which is related with responsibility, must come hand in hand with judicial independence. And therefore, for a republic, a state governed by limited or restricted exercise of power, and hence the term authority, judicial officers have to account to the citizenry of this country. And that is why we have Article 10 being a meta principle provision of the Constitution, decreeing that accountability shall be one of the materials that ought to preponderate state activity. Now, what are the elements of accountability? We ought to have participation. We ought to have transparency, evaluation of what the Judicial Service Commission is doing, and feedback. Feedback is one thing. We also have to raise concerns with the manner in which the Office of Judicial Ombudsperson has been anchored. We have the Office of Judicial Ombudsperson embedded and headed by actively serving judicial officers. For the longest time ever, It was headed by a magistrate. At some point, it went to be embedded within the office of the Deputy Chief Justice. We no longer are sure whether that is the same position, but it raises fundamental questions as to whether an ombudsperson's office can truly be said to be independent if it is embedded within the very same institution it's supposed to be receiving complaints about. The history of the ombudsperson's office, first established in Sweden circa 1704 and transported and utilized all over the world, will show you that for proper functioning of any ombudsperson's office, it has not only to be independent, it has to be seen to be independent. So when you have an ombudsperson's office embedded within the judiciary, that raises fundamental questions. There can never be accountability in that manner. Now, what will be my guided advice in terms of accountability? Any structures, any modes of accountability so selected have to value others. There has to be respect for members of the public. And to those who are serving in judicial office, is this a adage that always comes to mind? Be you so high, the law is always above you. So you're not there to be that chief, that king, lord wielding the big stick. You are a servant of the law, and you have to be under the law, and you have to account to the citizens of this country. So you have to value and respect the citizens of this country. We have to have records in terms of what the process of accountability is doing. We don't have records, we don't have material from the proceedings of some of the activity of the JSC. JSC, as I said, operates in an opaque manner. People have to take responsibility. It's no longer fashionable or prudent for you to bury things, sweep them under the carpet, bury them under the table, and think it will be business as usual. The world today is exceedingly dynamic, and things have changed. So you have to take responsibility, and taking responsibility includes people resigning. We live in this country. We have seen situations where there is serious questions raised about certain people serving in certain offices, but they will hold offices with their dear lives. I believe it is in this country where we had someone say that I'd rather die than resign. The office is not personal to you. The office is a public trust conferred on you by the people of the Republic. And the pristineness, the cleanliness of the office supersedes any one individual. Do the right thing. That is another step that I would recommend for anyone modeling an accountability mechanism, that what needs to guide any person is that when modeling an accountability mechanism, you have to do the right thing, whether you are seen or not seen. We need to nip this uneasy cloud, this miasma that has been spreading around of late. I saw one on social media yesterday where the ghost of corruption is said to be rearing its ugly head within the judicial ranks. So we need to deal with those, and we need to do the right thing. If somebody is found guilty or is suspected of engaging in corruption, you have no business occupying any office, let alone the high
Recording
office,
in progress.
judicial office. Act properly and act promptly. Act properly and act promptly and act with care. We need to see expedited results. We need to act promptly. We need to give account of what we are doing to the public. That does not happen, then we will have a problem. So, Lucianna, the diagnosis from practitioners' point of view is that the envisaged promise of the Constitution, the high promise of the Constitution 2010, is yet to be realized. We need to depart from the old archaic culture of people who think that they are high and above everyone else and they cannot account to anyone. That is a culture prevalent in all spheres of our society, not only in the judiciary, but within the executive parliament. We need to remind everyone that Article 1, 2, and 3 enumerates locus of power, and that locus of power resides in the people, reposits in the people. So everybody has to account to the people of this republic and respect the people of this republic. Thank you, Lucianna.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Ogada. You have echoed what our chief guest has said this morning about how judges perceive the person to whom they're accountable. And you have indicated that your concern is that even though our constitution proposes a culture of transformation, that culture of transformation cannot happen if the judicial officers feel that there is no one to whom they are to account. Just similar to what our chief guest said this morning. I will summarize quickly what you have said, which is that the Judicial Service Commission is opaque, and we cannot have accountability without participation, transparency, evaluation, and feedback. And so your concern is that if we keep the accountability mechanism anchored within the judiciary, we will not have any accountability. You're proposing that judges start to value the public, that there should be a taking of responsibility by the Judicial Service Commission, and that mechanism should act promptly, properly, and with care. There should be accountability for what that mechanism does with the power, the trust that is entrusted to that institution. We will come back to you for plenary, but thank you for those insights from a practitioner's perspective. Allow me to invite Chris Gitari to give us his thoughts on what should institutions do in both promoting independence and creating accountability.
Thank you, Lucianna. So on the one hand, you can then see international or regional players do something about judicial independence and accountability for post-conflict countries. When we come to Kenya, or we would consider post-authoritarian countries, post-authoritarian because if you understand our issues being a strong convergence of the power of the executive and the need to disperse it, we have created Chapter 15 institutions, and their role has been to disperse executive power and authority because of the tyranny of the presidency. The question that then begs is how effective these institutions have been in promoting judicial independence. There have been positive and negative experiences worth reflecting. Allow me to begin, of course, with the negative. Mr. Ogada has just reflected on that a little bit. He's reflected on the role of the JSC in promoting judicial independence and the challenges they had actually at the coast just recently, where JSC was seen to mistreat advocates and not be accountable to advocates. We have also seen instances where you see the EACC being used to, for example, intimidate judges, or what appears to intimidate judges. And of course, we have also had instances where, on the positive, we have seen independent institutions come forward to protect judicial independence. Time and again, we saw the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights return to court on the question of Miguna, and actually after 10 orders had to be issued. And the KNCHR repeatedly went back to court and asked the court to reaffirm the court orders it had given on Miguna's plight. So we then can see also when the KNCHR and other bodies issue reports before the United Nations Human Rights Council, when you're reporting, for example, on the ICCPR, and there are these regular cyclical reports or the Universal Periodic Review reports, reporting on judicial independence and accountability and drawing attention to where there are shortcomings. So you do see independent institutions do sometimes undertake actions and activities that reinforce and reaffirm judicial independence and accountability. I think, therefore, just to drill down just slightly in terms of what my colleagues have noted, is that we are, as ICJ, needing to be more fit for purpose to demand these institutions to, for example, give us regular reports, and I don't think many of us get those reports, on what is the state of the judiciary. We expect, for example, the Ombudsman to be giving us perspectives on when you have complaints within the judiciary by Kenyans and those not being attended to, what do they do about it? Because we do know Kenyans do complain about the efficiency and efficacy of the judiciary. There have been very many complaints by advocates about bribery in the judiciary, and it could be of administrative nature. Of course, there is also one that interferes with cases, and that, of course, would go to other independent institutions. We should expect to be seeing more regular reporting and actions around this, of course, also from JSC. That's a touchy subject, but it's an issue that is really affecting advocates because it's affecting their bottom line. I think also, as ICJ, we should be more forceful about these particular issues. I do know that in September, the chair of the ICJ did actually issue a statement castigating the president, who went after the judiciary just because they ruled against the Finance Act. And so we have been at least forthright there, but I think we can do much more. I think we are partners with the judiciary, but I think we need to take them on a little bit more strongly in the coming years so that this partnership is based on accountability. And therefore, just in closing, I would also urge ICJ to look beyond the borders. We have judicial reforms in other countries around us, and those countries, the lack of judicial independence affects us. Just last week, Tina, my colleague in council, in their report, the UN Commission for Human Rights South Sudan, did reflect on what we consider renditions from Kenya into South Sudan. These are persons who are wanted across the border, and you have security agencies walking into Kenyan borders, and they take them back across the border. These persons then are subject to torture and do disappear. Now, what is the role of our agencies in this regard, security agencies, and what is the role of the judiciary in holding these persons to account? I think there's great questions to be asked there. But also I think greater questions is, for ICJ, isn't it time to also work across the border in strengthened judiciaries across those borders so that we are all better and safer? So I think our call to working on judicial independence and accountability in other countries around this region within the East African community, I think, is a great opportunity to start thinking about from this AJC. Thank you.
Thank you. Allow me to at the JSC level. We know that there have been reports issued by the Law Society about how it's treating lawyers. And there's also the question of what does the JSC do with complaints concerning judges? I think that is something that has recurred in that conversation. Chris has also encouraged institutions to continue to push for the independence of the judiciary, whether it's by asking for reports from the JSC or also pushing in terms of litigation. How do we use institutions to push for accountability within that mechanism? And his last point is around exhorting the ICJ to be more forceful in its engagement and also consider working beyond borders to ensure that judicial accountability remains a reality. Dudley had begun, and I'm now just segueing into the plenary. Dudley had begun by asking two questions which I think are important. The first one is the judiciary helping us in understanding certain parts of the law, or is the judiciary obfuscating our understanding? And he brought to the fore the challenge we have with Chapter 6. Are we clearer on the obligations that are imposed by Chapter 6 based on judicial interpretation, or are we more confused by the judiciary? The second question he asked is on the place of public interest litigation, and he cautioned that we should all be concerned based on what the Supreme Court told us in the mass surveillance case, on the question of who can be a person who brings a public interest litigation, where the LSK is slapped with costs. What does that mean in terms of precedent for public interest litigation? Are the courts discouraging litigation by issuing negative cost orders?